In one of his books, Wang Shenjai says that Yiquan is about power, the correct generation and transmission of kinetic force based on quintessence principles of wushu. And he compares that with techniques which he says are secondary. So power is the most important thing, and techniques are just like crystallized forms, moments of Taolu, i.e. form in which power is expressed. And we've looked at that quite a lot in the beginner's series. And he makes it clear that he didn't even want any techniques in Yiquan, none at all. And he tells this Zen koan about a crying baby, which I didn't really get, I have to say. I'll have to think about it, but the upshot of the story is he compares his students to crying babies and says, like, they want techniques. They're like crying babies. They can't understand where the Yiquan really is. So they're like these crying babies who want techniques. So he gives them techniques, and he says he invents these techniques to pass on to them so that they can understand more easily what it is that he's trying to get across. And this is one of the many times, by the way, that he's talking about this key concept from the Tao Te Ching, that the way is not far from the people, it's only your expectations of the way that keep you separate from it, i.e. disappoint your expectations. You will be disappointed. There will be a lull of pointlessness that you have to get through, just like the crying baby, crying because you're disappointed because you want it to be about techniques. In fact, at the end of that book, he makes another really important point about disappointing your expectations. He says, if you want to achieve parity with the master, first of all, cut the master's level in half, i.e. Wang Shenjai was nowhere near as good as you think he was, and he tells you that himself. Disappoint your expectations, and then the goal immediately becomes 50% nearer. Anyway, this is hardly cutting a long story short, is it? Cutting a long story short, all of his students say, no, actually you do need to think about techniques, and you need to bring into this paradigm of power generation some kind of overarching concept that's related to a sophisticated understanding of the reality of the context of the fight. Listen, there's no Han's Yiquan. There's no Yao's Yiquan. Be like that crying baby. I can't, I'm not the Buddha. I can't help people separate from their attachments. I've got attachments of my own that I've got to deal with. But these things don't exist. Think about when we talked about in the beginner series that within Yiquan, the same idea just repeats again and again, but on ever more sophisticated levels. And now also think about Wang Shenjai's reinterpretation of the concept of Taolu to mean that in a unique moment, you create a specific configuration to achieve a particular martial arts goal within that moment. So to hit someone, or to move someone, or to move yourself out of the way of them, to defend, using the principles, the essential quintessence principles of wushu, you create a momentary configuration. But now expand that idea so that it becomes a configuration so big that it includes an entire paradigm of understanding violence, an entire framework for thinking about how to hit someone, how to use footwork, what to do in a fight, how to respond to different kinds of attacks. We're talking about things like Xing Yiquan, or Western boxing, or Bagua, or Taiji Chuan, Yong Chun. All of these, what in their own right we can call styles, when we bring them in as a configuration through which we feed the quintessence principles of wushu, then it becomes what we call a cultural set. It's precisely the same idea as Wang Shenjai's reinterpretation of Taolu to mean a configuration in the moment, only we've escalated it onto a much bigger scale. And Wang Shenjai's students did this because they had to, because it wasn't good enough on its own. What Wang Shenjai was doing, and Wang Shenjai himself tells us, each one specifically designed around self-defense, specifically designed around the idea of breaking hands. There's a reason why it's called breaking hands. It's designed to defend against someone who moves in on you, and then you engage them and engage in a self-defense posture. And as I've said before, that makes Wang Xianjai's life a hell of a lot easier, because it's far easier to make all of those postures work. I know it myself because you can see videos of me doing it when I'm sparring. It's much easier to do those things when someone is moving in on you. But if you want to take each one and you want to expand it and you want to widen its horizons, then you have to think beyond the way that Wang Xianjai is thinking. And in fact, making those things work against people who are higher level, so this so-called like one touch and disrupt the opponent's posture, making that actually work in practice is difficult. And the better people are at martial arts, the more difficult it is. So it's not enough to just rely on this idea of having power and a very small number of techniques. Everyone knew that, and particularly as people were living in different ages and different times, or engaging in different things, or they couldn't quite make it work in the way that Wang Xianjai made it work, or they wanted to make it work for different things. So Wang Xianjai's thinking about self-defense, and they're thinking about competition or challenge fights where you've got to be more aggressive. You can't just wait for someone to move in. Or they're very forward thinking, like Zhao Daoxin, basically thinking about MMA long before it's invented. So they think about these different kinds of cultural sets, or these martial arts paradigms that already exist, like for example Xing Yiquan, which you can then just apply the power generating principles of Yiquan to, and you can create something, a hybrid. Wang Xianjai himself says you can adapt things from different martial arts as long as it doesn't contradict the essential principles of each one, because once you do that, then it's not each one, but you can bring in anything and adapt it. But cultural sets are more than this. They're whole sets of ideas, whole ways of thinking about having a fight. Xing Yiquan itself is a whole configuration in itself, a whole paradigm for thinking about how you deal with a fight. Which then, of course, brings us on to this quite famous discussion about Yao Zongzun bringing in concepts from Western boxing. Actually, if you look at Yao Zongzun's own movement, it doesn't look very much like Western boxing. It's much more his sons that bring in much closer to what we would recognise as Western boxing, but still lots of stuff that isn't from Western boxing. There's no kicks in Western boxing, so that does get a little bit over-egged, I have to say. And particularly with Yao Zongzun, when you look at his movement, it's influenced by, but it's clearly not Western boxing. And his students have written about that and written about this idea of bringing in like the rational core of Western boxing. In fact, I've got a memoir from one of his students, but I'm not sure who it is because I forgot to copy over the name, but he talks about this idea of bringing in the rational core, by which he means thinking about Western boxing basically as a cultural set paradigm, a whole way of thinking about the reality of the context of the fight. And it is true that these things changed. It is true that self-defense is different to sport and so on. And it's also true that sport changes over time. So all of these things are true. But what I want to do now is think about cultural sets and demonstrate them in a different way. And I'm going to get a little bit out of my comfort zone because I'm going to do some stuff that I don't normally practice. I don't normally do that kind of old school sort of each one. And my intent is very much opposed to it, I have to say. It didn't want to let me do it. It's like saying, no, come on, this isn't the appropriate way of doing this posture. So I found it a little bit challenging myself to film this, and I haven't quite got some of the things exactly right. I can't do the old footwork particularly because it used more lifting the foot and stamping down to compensate for the way they used to set postures, whereas the modern way of doing it is so much more advanced than that. I can't go back to doing it like that. I find it really difficult. My body just forgets to do, even if I try and keep it in mind, it won't do that old way of setting postures. Anyway, what I'm going to try and do is continue this idea of the logical model. So it's not about this teacher said do it like this and this teacher said do it like that and who's best and we're the real each one and we're the real, this Yao brother was better than that Yao brother, so we're the real Yao's each one, and this student was older, so he's the real Yao's each one, and so all this kind of stuff that goes on. Thinking about it completely differently, thinking about it in this kind of logical model way of thinking as a process of historical development and why it develops. I'm going to try and demonstrate that, and I'm going to try and bring it up to the way I do it, which isn't exactly like, I have to say, it's not exactly like the Yao brothers, For example, when the Yao brothers do a jab and a cross, they use much more open, whereas I use more open and rise. So my mix is different. My mix of contexts is different. When they do it slowly, they do it using open and rise, but when they do it fast, they tend to do it using more open. So going all the way through from the original, or what we imagine, or what from Wang Shangjai students we can see was something like the original, through into the way that I do it, and explaining why it's developed like that over time. And I should say, I didn't develop it like that in the way that I do it. That's how I was taught to do it by my teacher. So I've said before, I'm not quite sure why he does it like that, but it is slightly different anyway. Certainly slightly different to the people that he's learned from. However, it is correct. It's scientifically demonstrable that if you just change the mix to use more rise and less open, or more rise and less close for a cross, if you just change that mix, it's more powerful. You can feel it on the bag. You can demonstrate it empirically and scientifically. And critically, none of that contradicts any of the core Yiquan principles. It's just how we use them, how we put them together. Anyway, that is not cutting a long story short. And I'm so far in now, I'll have to start afresh with a new video anyway to do that. But that's just to introduce the idea of cultural sets, and just to get this concept across, which is so different. I mean, yeah, people will be like that crying baby. I love that metaphor, because it's like, once you stop crying, well, actually the reality is far more interesting thinking about it like this, that you can bring in all these different kinds of paradigms into each one, as long as you don't lose Wang Shangjai uses the word purity. Don't lose the purity of the essential things. It's eternal principles, but infinite creativity. So I saw someone saying, well, Western boxing's got a completely different way of moving to Yiquan principles. And yes, I accept that. That's absolutely the case. But that's not the point, is it? Because it's not about techniques. It's about technique. So by technique, we mean actual body movement, that important thing. From there, you can add any technique, as in a punch or something like that. A kick can be added onto that, as long as it's using those same core principles of movement that we identify as Yiquan. And the important thing about that is it allows it to be future-proofed. So what we understand about the reality of the context of the fight changes. So it allows it, for example, to adapt to things like MMA or Sandar, or different kinds of modern competition format, and also modern concepts around self-defense. It makes it adaptive. Why would we ever want to lose that?